Mod Squad background here yet, if you're old enough to remember the Mod Squad. But my shirt does have significance. I'm reminded of the pirate, or the sailing captain back in the 17th century, and he saw a pirate ship coming, and he ordered his crew go up alongside the pirate ship, and they lined up their cannons. But before he did, he hollered up to the first mate, and he said, "First mate, bring me my white cape and my red pants." And so they pulled up alongside this pirate ship, the cannons fired, they sunk the pirate ship. One of the people on the ship that was visiting said, "Well, don't you think that was just a little bit of a showboat to call for a white cape and red pants?" He said, "No, not at all." He said, "If I had been wounded in battle, the red pants would have kept the blood from being visible to my troops." I didn't think about that. So up from the crow's nest comes another call, says, "Enemy ships off the starboard bow." "How many ships?" 3, 4, 7. The captain looks at his first mate and he says, "Bring me my red cape and my brown pants." I'm reminded, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off or put it on vibrate so you're not going to be disturbing the speakers as we go through the session this morning. And when it comes time to take questions, we have 4 mic runners on the floor. Those will be at your disposal, so if you have a question, raise your hand, one of them will bring it around. As moderator, I will not recognize your question unless you're speaking into the microphone, so please help us with that situation. And with that, Dwayne, if I could have the first slide, there we go. I want to start off with a show of hands. How many of you have ever skipped the plenary because it was deemed boring? You didn't really care what the local politicians had to say. I can't hardly see, but I see a few hands out there. How many of you have ever carried a drip torch? Show of hands. Stand proud. All right. How many of you have ever suffered an escape when you were burning? They didn't hold their hands quite so proudly, but there are quite a few hands out there. How many of you have been frustrated by the frequency that they slap a burn ban on these days? Isn't that something? How many of you have ever been a subject to a letter to the editor? I always look for patterns, and 3 of them are sitting right over here. I don't know what that means. How many of you have been a subject of a letter to the editor twice in successive weeks? That's when you get a call from the department head or the dean or the chief of the Forest Service, whoever. How many of you have been frustrated by your administration relative to their stance on burning and your role as a pyro manager? We won't ask for a show of hands on that one. I'd like to recognize 2 people right off the bat. The first one is Dave Engel, who I had the pleasure of working with several years. And the second one is Dwayne Elmore. Dave and Dwayne are in the back somewhere, both with Oklahoma State University, and they're responsible for putting together the program for the plenary session. And they told me, they said, they want this plenary session to be the best ever in SRM history. And I said, well, I've been to some of them, and that doesn't say just a whole lot, but we're skipping some of the politicians and so forth and getting right to the heart of the matter. And as I mentioned, you'll notice on the agenda, there's no words from the local mayor or governor. Now, I thought that was a slide on Dave's part. And being a native Okie, I at least did want to introduce the Honorable Mary Fallon, who's the governor of Oklahoma, and Mick Cornett is there. But that's all we're going to hear from the politicians today, current politicians. If you're a native of Oklahoma and at least my age, you might remember a governor from the 1970s, George Nye. Now, prior to getting into politics, George Nye was a history teacher down in McAllister, Oklahoma, a couple hundred miles southeast of Oklahoma City. And I've heard him speak on numerous occasions, and he used to say something that I thought was really significant. We study the past and apply it to the present that we may affect the future. Let's ruminate on that just a minute. We study the past, apply it to the present that we may affect the future. And I think if there was a quote to underline our theme for the plenary session, it would be that one. And certainly here in Oklahoma, we have a rich heritage with Native Americans, many tribes, and we all laud their knowledge of fire. Now, I hesitate to call them pyro managers. They weren't pyromaniacs, but did they really have a full understanding of fire, or were they what I call patternologists? They knew that bison were attracted to green areas, or they could drive bison with the use of fire. But certainly a long history of fire in the Southern Great Plains as a result of Native Americans. Now, this is my preacher in San Angelo, Texas. If you ever come to visit me, I hope you'll go to church with me on Sunday morning. This is Preacher Paul. Now, Preacher Paul, he can preach on grace and salvation, or he can preach on fire and brimstone. Most of the time, it's grace and salvation. But if he ever starts off a sermon by this, I want y'all to know I'm not mad at any of you. What is he prefacing the congregation for? A little fire and brimstone that day. He's saying, heed the message, but don't shoot the messenger. I hereby invoke the first of Preacher Paul's precautionary professions. If anybody on the session today says something that steps on your toes, heed the message, but don't shoot the messenger. Don't take it personally. Preacher Paul also says you're free to choose your actions, but you're not free to choose the consequences. Can I have an amen? Any parent will amen that, because they've told their teenager that on many occasions. As we think about Preacher Paul's second one and the consequences of a fire ban, if you will, or fire suppression over the history of any state, especially in Oklahoma is a great example of that. We see that we pay the fiddler in terms of, especially in Red Cedar in Oklahoma. Okay, a couple more introductions. This first one is no stranger. Every one of you could cipher some Aldo Leopold quotes. But there was another great philosopher that lived during Aldo Leopold's time that you may not think about in the same vein that you think about Aldo Leopold. And he's a native Okie. In fact, he's Oklahoma's favorite son, Will Rogers. They were contemporaries. I don't know if they ever met, but they had common principles. One is that their headlines are just as appropriate today as they were when they said them in the 20s or 30s. Leopold, one of his that might be especially germane today, is that the urge to comprehend must precede the urge to reform. Will had several. All I know is just what I read in the newspapers. The rest of that one is, and that's an alibi for my ignorance. America's good fortune can't possibly last longer than our natural resources. A conference is just an admission that you want someone to join you in your troubles. And finally, people's opinions are changed by observation and not by argument. Quote Mark Twain, the difference between the right word and almost the right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. How many of you have suffered politically in the press because when you talk about prescribed fire, somebody suggests that's wildfire? Sound alike, totally different meanings. And again, we've had a long history of trying to change some of those policies. I thought we were making good progress in Texas until 2006. That's when we had the Amarillo wildfires that burned 1 million acres. And then in 2011, we burned over 3 million acres. That's a satellite photo from 17th of April showing much of West Texas afire. Fire management took a big step backwards as a result of those 2 years, in my opinion. Last thing I want to do before I introduce our panelists is talk about some of those that have paved the way. The top two are quite familiar to this crowd. Henry Wright. I had the good fortune of being a student at Texas Tech and take Dr. Wright's fire ecology class. Charlie Cyphers in the upper right is especially well thought of in Texas and also at Oklahoma State because he revamped the range management program up there. Two guys on the left were torches in my life. Bill Armstrong from the Kerr Wildlife area, who used white-tailed deer and endangered songbirds to promote the gospel of fire and ecology. And then Alan Herman from Shackford County, Texas. The point is, go home and thank those individuals. They say that one generation plants the tree and another enjoys the shade. If you participate in prescribed burning days, somebody's helped pave the way. Go home and thank them. The last term I want to introduce you to is pyromancy. I learned this term from a fellow graduate student at Texas Tech back in the early 80s. And pyromancy is foretelling the future with fire. That's a tough task, but that's what we're tasking our panelists to do. learn from the past, and talk about how it can be used in today's and tomorrow's society. Our four panelists bring a lot of experience to the table. We'll be starting with Tom Swetnam. So Tom, if you'll start making your way up this way, we will get you mic'd up and I'll get you introduced.